The wind off the Kareth basin came in sideways and smelled like iron. Male Durin had learned to read weather by smell out here. 3 seasons of it had taught him more than 30 years of living on stations ever had. Iron smell meant the dust plume was still 4 hours out. Copper meant it was overhead. Salt meant you'd already missed it and were breathing the aftershock. He was at the well housing when it hit him, the iron, and he set down his wrench and looked south. The sky there was the color of an old bruise, dark rust at the base and a sickly amber where it thinned. He had maybe 3 hours to finish the seal on the secondary draw pipe, get the canopies down on the hydroponics bays, and get himself inside. He picked up the wrench and went back to work. Keth Station had been a working agricultural relay when the Cowran Compact decommissioned it 6 years ago. Someone had built it optimistically, expecting the basin's aquifer to support more than it could. They'd been wrong and they'd left. 14 empty habitat modules, a hydroponic array designed for 200 that now fed 12, a borehole that still worked if you bobbied the pump seals, and a communications relay that worked on its best days and sulked on its worst. Mail had arrived as the station's maintenance contractor, a 1-year posting to keep the decommissioned equipment from failing badly enough to contaminate the local water table, and had stayed because, by the time the contract ended, 8 families had come to live here, and it seemed wrong to leave people with a failing pump. He was not a man who left when there was still work to do. The secondary draw pipe gave him 15 minutes of trouble before the seal seated properly. He worked with his back to the southern sky and checked the color of the light on the housing metal to judge how much time he was losing. When the light went from white gold to a flat amber, he stood, collected his tools, and started walking toward the hydroponic bays at a pace he'd learned to call his working hurry, fast enough to matter, not fast enough to sweat through his collar before he got there. The hydroponic bays were the station's most valuable and most temperamental asset. The array had been designed for 200, but 12 families used only the central 6 bays, and the outer ring had been sealed and let go dormant. What remained was still complicated. 16 varieties of crop, an irrigation network that required daily calibration, a lighting system that had developed its own opinions about which spectrum it preferred. Mail had spent the first 3 months learning the system's moods before he'd started persuading it to behave. Now, most days, it cooperated. But the canopies had to come down before a storm, or the particulate load in the air would coat the light panels and set the whole array back a week. He'd gotten the first 3 canopy arms down, and was working on the 4th when he heard the engine. It was wrong for the storm. Anything sensible would have turned for shelter an hour ago. He finished the canopy arm, secured the latch, and looked up. The craft was a light civilian transport, the kind rated for short planetary hops. It was descending steeply, not an emergency angle, but steep enough to tell him the pilot was hurrying. The hull color was a dark mineral blue that had been bleached pale on the leading edges, the way everything bleached out here eventually. It came down about 200 meters east of the station perimeter and settled in the flat with a billow of pale dust. Mail finished the 5th canopy arm, secured the 6th, and then walked to the perimeter to see who had come. The ramp was already down when he got there. She came out of it the way he used to come out of airlocks on the station runs, with a child on one arm and her eyes moving over the terrain before the rest of her had fully committed to the ground. She was tall, taller than he remembered, though he supposed she wasn't taller, he'd just forgotten. Her skin was the deep amber gold of the Thessi people, the warm dark undertone that made her look lit from somewhere inside, and her hair was pulled back in a work not the color of dark copper gone slightly green at the temple where the sun had gotten to it. She wore a field vest with full pockets, worn at the cuffs, and basin boots that had seen real use, not city boots pulled on for the occasion. She was carrying a child. The child had her mother's coloring and was perhaps 2 years old, perhaps slightly younger, and was watching the world over her mother's shoulder with enormous pale gold eyes that had the particular alertness of a small creature still learning to distinguish safe from not safe. The child's gaze moved the same way her mother's did, deliberate sweeps, then a point of focus, then another sweep, methodical, working. Mail stopped at the perimeter. The woman saw him and went still. He'd seen her do that before. The stillness that was not uncertainty, the stillness of a long-range sensor making a detailed pass, cataloging distance and angle, and everything about the environment that needed noting before she committed to motion. He'd learned, the first time, not to break it. People who interrupted Thessi women in that kind of stillness didn't understand what they were looking at. He waited. She came down the rest of the ramp and crossed the flat toward him, and her steps were the same, that particular quality of someone who had spent years on uneven terrain and no longer needed to think about where she put her feet. The dust of the flat barely moved around her boots. She stopped 3 meters away. The wind had picked up since he'd looked south, and it moved her hair across her forehead, and she didn't push it back. "Mail Duran," she said. "Varith Asa." His voice came out even, he was not certain how. "You came a long way." "Yes." The child on her arm looked at him with those pale gold eyes and said something short and pointed in a language that was partly Thessi and partly something Mail didn't recognize, some stage of language that belonged entirely to the child, the built vocabulary of a person still assembling what talking was for. Varith glanced down at her and said something quiet. "She wants to know if you're the human," Varith said. Mail looked at the child. The child looked back at him with an expression that conveyed, very clearly, that she had asked a reasonable question and was waiting for an adult to address it seriously. "I'm a human," he said. "Whether I'm the one she has in mind depends on what she's been told." "She's been told about the man who fixed the water at the place her mother stayed when she was lost," Varith said. "She's been told his name." The wind came in a long gust and brought the iron smell with it, much stronger, almost metallic now, closer to copper than iron. Mail looked south. The bruise in the sky had grown considerably. The flat between the station and the mesa faces had taken on the odd flat light that came just before a storm swallowed the direct sun. "Storm's got 2 hours, maybe less," he said. "You should get your ship tied down. I have ground anchors in the equipment bay." "I know," Varith said. "You always have what is needed for the situation at hand." He didn't know what to do with that, so he went to get the ground anchors. They got the transport secured with 40 minutes to spare. Varith worked the way she always had, quickly, efficiently, and without narrating what she was doing. She had been on enough survey postings, in enough difficult weather, that storm prep was automatic. She knew how to read a tie-down cleats, and she knew the correct angle for a forward anchor in loose basin soil, and she used both pieces of knowledge without asking for guidance, which was the kind of competence that was easy to underestimate until you saw it. The child had been settled inside the equipment bay, with a travel kit that unfolded into a small enclosed play space. She played in it with the focused seriousness of a person who had important business to attend to and was attending to it, examining each component of the play space in turn, pressing the panels, testing the joins, building a mental map of the structure from the inside out. Mail tied the forward lines. Varith took the aft without being asked. When they were done, they went inside. The main habitat module smelled like dust and machine oil, and the particular herbal thing that grew along the north wall of the hydroponics bay, which had the habit of venting its air circulation in a direction no one had intended. There was also something underneath it, the particular warmth of a place that was lived in, that had heat in the walls and food in the cabinets and tools in their places. Mail had stopped noticing it years ago, and noticed it now only because someone else was in it for the first time in a long time. He put water on for tea, proper tea, the kind in the lower cabinet that he'd gotten from the supply run 3 months ago and hadn't touched since. because the supply runner brought it from the same orbital depot that had once stocked the station he'd worked before this one, and he'd never quite figured out how to feel about that. Vareth sat at the work table with the child on her knee. The child had decided to conduct a close examination of the edge of the table, and was doing so with the methodical focus of a geologist cataloging strata, running her small fingers along the grain, pressing the underside, testing where the joint met the leg. 4 years, Mail said, because someone had to say it. 4 years and 3 months, Vareth said, by the compact calendar. I didn't know where you went. I know, I had reasons for not leaving a contact record. They were good reasons at the time. She paused. They may have been overcautious. She looked at her daughter, who was still absorbed in the table edge. I was not reasoning well for some of it. He set 2 cups on the table and poured. He set a small cup with a flat bottom next to hers, filled with cooled water, because there was a child present and children didn't want tea. The child immediately abandoned the table edge, lifted the small cup with both hands, and drank with an expression of serious satisfaction. Teva, Vareth said. What do you say? The child put down the cup and looked at Mail with those enormous pale eyes, and said something that was clearly, thank you, in 2 languages at once, stacked on top of each other the way small children stacked things before they learned to keep them separate. You're welcome, Mail said. Teva went back to the table edge. Mail picked up his tea. Tell me from the beginning, he said, if you want to, or tell me the part that matters. Either way. Vareth was quiet for a moment. Not the sensor stillness, something else. Something that was deciding where to start, and also, he thought, deciding how honest to be about the parts of the story that didn't reflect well on the person telling it. He waited. He was good at waiting. He had met her 3 years before Teva. He'd been 3 months into the Keth station posting. The Karath Basin was not a place people came through voluntarily. It was a transit zone, technically, but the route through it had been decommissioned along with the station, and the new transit lanes ran 200 kilometers east. The basin saw lost travelers, equipment runners who'd miscalculated their range, and occasionally someone running from something who'd decided that difficult to find was more important than hospitable. Vareth had been none of those things exactly. She'd come down in a damaged ship, not damaged in the way you got from weather or bad piloting, but damaged in a specific way that Mail had recognized immediately from his years on stations. Someone had sabotaged the navigation array. It was precise work, the kind that left the ship flyable but directionless, so the person in it would exhaust their fuel looking for landmarks and come down wherever the tank ran out. It was a way of losing someone without technically killing them. It was also the kind of work that required specific knowledge of the ship's architecture, not a stranger's sabotage, but a colleague's or a supervisor's or someone who had been given access. He hadn't asked about that part then. It hadn't seemed like his business. She'd come down 4 kilometers from the station, which was close enough that Mail had picked up the descent on the relay. He'd taken the rover out across the flat in the afternoon light, the basin stretching pale and enormous on all sides, the mesa faces going amber in the late sun. She had been sitting on the ramp of her ship in the flat Karath afternoon, watching his approach with the same sensor stillness he would come to know well, and the first thing she'd said to him was, I am Vareth Asa of the Thessi Compact Survey Division. I am not injured. My ship has a navigational fault I cannot repair without parts I don't have. I don't know where I am. He'd told her where she was. She had been quiet for a moment and then said, That's farther than I thought. He'd given her water, which she'd accepted without ceremony. He'd towed her ship back to the station on the rover's line, which she'd watched with a focused attention that suggested she was filing the technique for future reference. The angle of the hitch, the tension of the line, the way you corrected for the slope variation where the flat met the approach road. He'd offered her the spare habitat module, which she'd accepted without ceremony, and she'd been at Keth Station for 6 weeks while he sourced and fabricated the parts her navigation array needed. She was a surveyor by training and habit. She spent the 6 weeks the way she would have spent them anywhere useful, mapping. She walked the basin with equipment she pulled from her ship's cargo bay and cataloged the aquifer's east boundary, the soil composition of the flat, the wind patterns across the mesa faces, the infrared signature of the deep groundwater. She did this alone and systematically, leaving before the direct sun was fully up and returning in the long amber afternoon, her field vest uniformly dusty, her notes already organized in the small notebook she kept in her left vest pocket. She had, he learned, 3 colors of notation: blue for confirmed data, red for provisional findings, green for anomalies that needed a return visit. The return visit list grew quickly. She did not talk about what had happened to her navigation array. He did not ask. What she did instead was work, and what he did was work, and the station had more than enough work for 2 careful people. They ate dinner together in the evenings because it was more efficient to cook once for 2 people, and because the alternative was eating alone in a habitat module, while someone else was eating alone in another habitat module, which was wasteful, and also, he admitted to himself only much later, because by the end of the first week the prospect of eating alone when there was someone else in the station had stopped making sense to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. They talked during those dinners, the way people talk when they are both careful people who have learned that most conversation is noise, and are therefore pleasantly surprised when it isn't. She told him about survey methodology and the specific problem of mapping basins, where the aquifer behavior didn't match the surface geology. A pattern she'd seen on 3 previous postings, each time with different geology but the same structural mismatch between what the initial survey predicted and what the data showed. He told her about pump mechanics and the specific problem of seals in high-particulate environments, and about the borehole housing's chronic tendency to accumulate particulate in the joint between the primary and secondary draws, which produced a catch in the pump cycle that was technically within tolerance, but which he kept nursing because within tolerance was not the same as correct. Neither of them performed interest, neither of them had to. She asked him at the end of the 4th week why he'd stayed at a decommissioned station. There were people here, he said, and the pump was failing. She'd looked at him for a moment with something specific in her eyes, not the sensor stillness, but something more evaluating, like she was checking a calculation she'd already run once and finding the same result. It was the look, he learned eventually, that she had when a piece of data confirmed what she'd suspected rather than contradicting it, a look of quiet, unsurprised satisfaction. "That's a complete answer," she said, as though some answers weren't. He thought about that for a while after she'd gone back to her module that night. He thought about what she'd meant by it, that a complete answer was one where the stated reason was the full reason, with nothing held back for later, no qualifications, no, but also appended. He'd been giving incomplete answers for most of his life without realizing it, not because he was dishonest, but because most conversations didn't require more than an approximate. She did, somehow without asking for it, she required it. He started paying more attention to the precision of what he said. By the 5th week, they were not just eating dinner together. He hadn't planned it. He suspected she hadn't either, though Vareth was the kind of person who didn't do things accidentally. She made decisions, and the decision was made, and that was different from planning, which implied time and advance notice. The decision had happened somewhere in the 5th week, arrived at by both of them without being discussed, in the way certain understandings arrive when 2 careful people have been paying sufficient attention to each other. The 6 weeks had a texture to them that he hadn't had words for at the time, and had found he still didn't, quite. They had the stripped-down quality that came from being 2 people in a difficult place with no audience and no performance to give. The basin was too large and too indifferent for performance. What he knew about her after 6 weeks was what she was like when there was nothing to pretend for, Meticulous, direct, privately funny in a way that didn't call attention to itself, uncomfortable with imprecision in a way that was sometimes impatience, but was more often simply a preference for the accurate thing over the easier thing. What she knew about him, he supposed, was the same order of knowledge. On the 42nd day, her navigation array was ready. She had spent the morning in her ship running systems checks, and the afternoon at the work table with her survey notes, organizing, coding, writing up the anomalies on her return visit list in a way that would make sense to a future surveyor, even without her being there to explain them. She'd been doing that methodically for 3 days, he'd noticed, getting it into a form that would outlast her presence. In the evening she'd come to where he was replacing a thermocouple in the heating unit, and stood in the doorway and said, "I can leave tomorrow." "I know," he said, without looking up from the thermocouple housing. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I don't have a way to stay." He'd looked up at that. She was watching him with the particular careful attention of someone who had said a true thing, and was waiting to see what it landed as. "Your survey work," he said. "There are 12 active postings. I've been marked absent without contact for 6 weeks. If I don't return within the next 5 days, I'll lose 2 of them." She paused. "I would not lose them easily." He understood that. She had built those postings over years, each one a negotiated contract with a survey authority that required a track record and references, and the specific credibility that came from delivering accurate work on schedule. Walking away from 2 of them for a person she'd known 6 weeks, in a place she'd arrived at by being stranded, was not a calculation that ended well regardless of how good those 6 weeks had been. "Then you should go," he said. She had. She left the next morning early, before the light had properly come up, and the flat between the station and the mesa faces was still gray with pre-dawn, the cold coming off the ground in the specific way it came off the ground before the sun reached it. He helped her run her pre-departure checks, careful, thorough, neither of them talking more than the task required, and secured the tow line after she'd gotten the ship off the flat, and watched it bank south in the new light until the engine note went quiet in the wind. She had not left a contact record. He'd stood in the flat for a while after the sound faded. Then he'd gone back to the station and replaced the thermocouple he hadn't finished the night before, and checked the pump cycle, and started the morning calibration on the hydroponic array, which was 12 minutes behind schedule. He'd assumed in the months that followed that she'd had reasons for the missing contact record. He'd assumed they were good ones. He was a person who assumed good faith when the evidence wasn't against it, and the evidence wasn't against it. She was careful. She was private. She had a life in other places that had claims on her that he had no right to second-guess. He'd kept fixing things at Keth Station and not thought about it more than he needed to, which was what you did. He had thought about it considerably more than he needed to, which was also what you did. "When I got back," Vareth said, "there were complications with the posting reallocation. 2 of the survey positions had been reassigned, not to other surveyors, but placed in administrative hold pending my return. The authority that managed them had a process for extended contact absence, and I had exceeded it by 11 days. Remediation required documentation, a formal review, a reinstatement timeline." She paused. "It took 4 months." "That sounds tedious and angry-making," she said, with a precision that suggested she had considered the phrasing carefully. "I had done nothing wrong except be placed in a situation where I was unfindable, and then been required to prove my continued fitness for work I had never stopped being qualified for. I was not pleasant company for most of it." She looked at Teva again. The child had migrated from the table edge to a close examination of the seam where the floor met the wall, which she was tracing with one careful finger. "I found out about Teva at the end of that process. I was not expecting it." "No," Mail said. "There are THESI assessments for this kind of finding," she said. "The documentation is thorough, Phenotype mapping, heritage notation, probability analysis. I will show you if you want to see it. She was giving him information, not managing his reaction. She didn't soften the edges. She is yours. It's documented. He looked at the child. Teva had found something specific at the wall seam and was pressing her palm flat against it with the expression of someone conducting an experiment whose results she had already hypothesized and was now confirming. She pressed once, twice, moved her palm 3 centimeters to the left, pressed again, checking for variance. He sat with it, with all of it, the 4 years and 3 months. The child who was his and hadn't been, all that time, anything except a person existing somewhere he didn't know about. The documentation, the pale gold eyes going back and forth across the wall seam. "Why didn't you?" he started. "I couldn't find you," Vareth said. "That's the first reason, and it's true, but it isn't the complete answer." He recognized his own phrase back at him and understood that she was being deliberately precise. The Keth station contact record had been archived when the compact decommissioned the relay. The maintenance registry had you listed at a different posting, your previous one, not updated when you stayed. By the time I found the correct relay address, I had been trying for 4 months, and Teva was 6 months old. And the second reason. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the habitat walls, the storm had moved close enough that the wind was audible, not the roar of its full body yet, but the leading edge, the high variable note of it feeling out the terrain. "I had left," she said. "I made a choice when I left. The reasons were real, I've explained them, and they were real, but I made the choice. Coming back to a person who had accepted that choice, and complicating his life with information that would require something of him whether he wanted it to or not." She stopped, organized what she was trying to say. It seemed like returning a weight I had unilaterally decided he didn't have to carry, and unilaterally deciding now that he did. "That wasn't your decision to make," he said, "whether I wanted to carry it." "No," she said, "it wasn't, I know that." She looked at him directly. "I also spent some time, not all of it, but some of it, telling myself that the distance and the time made it less necessary, that Teva was well, that she had everything she needed, that the notification could wait until the situation was clearer." She paused. "Those were not the real reasons." "What were they?" "I was afraid," she said. He waited. "Not of you," she said. "I was afraid of what it would mean if I came back and found you unchanged. Because then I would have to know clearly that I had waited 4 years when I didn't have to." She looked at the table. It was easier for some of it not to know. He sat with that too. The storm hit the perimeter in a long, sustained gust, and the habitat module adjusted to it the way it was designed to, a slight flex in the outer wall, a change in the air pressure, the particular sound that the seal around the door made when the wind loaded it from outside. Teva looked up at the ceiling with alert golden eyes, assessing. "The noise is the storm," Mail said. "It comes across the basin every season. It sounds large, and it is large, but the walls are built for it. You're safe in here." Teva looked at the ceiling for another 2 seconds, completing her assessment. Then she looked at him, and then at the wall she'd been examining, and returned to the seam. Vareth was watching him. "She does that," she said. "I know," he said. "I recognized it." The something in Vareth's face, the held careful thing, the thing that had been braced, shifted again. Another degree of release. Slow and careful, as everything she did was slow and careful. "I stayed away longer than I meant to," she said. "There were months when I intended to come and found a reason not to. I want to be honest about that." "You've been honest about most of it." "I want to be honest about all of it." She looked at him. "The Thessi documentation will show you the timeline, the registration of Teva's finding, the heritage notation, the date the correct contact record was located. You can verify each part of what I've told you." "I know," he said. "I'm not going to." A small silence. Then, "Why not?" "Because you're here," he said. People with bad intentions don't come 3 days' journey into a basin in the wrong season with a 2-year-old and arrive 40 minutes ahead of a storm. They don't tie down their own ship without being asked. She looked at him for a long moment. The held careful thing released another degree. "You should have been here 4 years ago," he said. It came out gentle. He hadn't meant it as an accusation. He meant it as a simple fact, the kind that was more useful when it was stated clearly than when it was left to be inferred. "But you're here now." "Yes," she said, "I am." He made dinner. It was not a complicated dinner. The station's storage ran to protein cakes, dried basin greens, the fermented grain paste that lasted forever in sealed containers, and a root vegetable that grew in the hydroponic bay's lower tier and was good roasted if you had time, which he had. He started the roots first, found bread in the lower cabinet that was still good if you didn't look at it too carefully, and put everything together with the competent efficiency of someone who had been cooking alone in a small kitchen for a long time and had learned to make the most of what was available. While he worked, he thought about the 4 years. He had not been idle in them. The pump was running better than it had since he'd arrived. The hydroponic array had been reconfigured twice, the second time based on what the first reconfiguration had taught him, and was now producing a third more than it had on the original design. He'd found and repaired 6 structural issues in the habitat modules that the original construction crew had missed, mapped the aquifer's west boundary himself using a soil conductance meter, and a methodology he'd worked out by reading survey literature, because there was a lot of time out here to read, and trained 2 of the family's older children in basic maintenance, so that the station's essential systems wouldn't depend on one person indefinitely. He had not thought about Varith Asa every day. He had thought about her on a sufficient number of days that the count had stopped seeming useful to keep. The basin had a particular quality of isolation that he'd learned was not loneliness. Isolation and loneliness were not the same thing, though they overlapped. What he'd had at Keth Station was mostly isolation. A full existence in a minimal place, the satisfactions of work done correctly in a location that demanded it. What he'd had occasionally, in the small hours or in the long amber afternoons when the work was done, and the wind was up, and there was nothing to do except watch the light change on the mesa faces, was something closer to loneliness, the awareness of an absence that had a shape. Varith sat at the work table. Teva, who had finished investigating the wall seam and moved on to the lower cabinet handles, was conducting a thorough assessment of each one, pull, resistance check, listen for the click, move to the next. "She's thorough," Mail said. "She finds every structural fault," Varith said. "In any room she's in, within about 20 minutes, she paused. "I found it alarming at first. I thought something was wrong with her, that she was anxious, that she couldn't settle. Then I realized she was settling. This is how she settles. She understands the structure she's in. When she knows all the joints and seams, she's at ease." "The lower cabinet's left side hinge is slightly loose," Mail said. "The seal on the upper right is worn." "She'll find them both," Varith said. She did. She found the loose hinge at 12 minutes. It moved when she pulled the handle, and she pulled it several times to confirm the movement, then looked at Mail with a specific expression that contained a complete report on the finding and a reasonable expectation that it would be addressed. "I know," he said. "It's on the list." Teva seemed to accept this as she had accepted the antenna housing. The expression cleared to neutral. She moved on to the next cabinet. During dinner, which Teva ate with focused efficiency, the bread torn into pieces of a specific size that she seemed to have decided on in advance, Varith told him about the survey work. Not the administrative complications, which she'd summarized, but the actual work. A 3-season basin analysis on a world called Orith, whose aquifer system had been mapped incorrectly in the original survey. So every water right assigned in the past 40 years was based on faulty data. "Similar structure to this basin," Mail said. similar in the specific way that matters. The initial survey used surface geology modeling to predict the aquifer boundary, and the modeling was wrong because the underlying formation is more fractured than it looks from the surface. The water doesn't go where the model predicts. She paused. The Kereth Basin has the same fault. The east boundary in the compact records is off by at least 3 kilometers. I thought so, he said. I've been watching the soil conductance on the eastern approaches. The pattern doesn't match the records. She looked at him. You have data. 6 notebooks. Weather, water, ground conditions, seasonal change in the scrub. I started them in the first month. It seemed like the kind of thing that might matter to someone eventually. Vareth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the Kereth Basin mapping errors informed my methodology on Oreth. I used the 6 weeks here, the preliminary east boundary data I collected before the navigation array was repaired, as a case study for the secondary channel identification problem. The methodology passed review. She said it simply as a fact. I've been citing the station and the season in the formal notes. He hadn't expected that. In the formal work, he said. In the methodology section, 3rd season report, page 47, secondary channel identification in high particulate basins, case study, Kereth Basin, Keth Station, 3rd season by the compact calendar. She looked at him steadily. The work you've been doing here for 3 years is the same work. Different tools, different vocabulary, but the same structure of observation. He sat with that for a moment. Teva, who had finished her dinner with the efficient finality of a person who doesn't linger over completed tasks, had crawled onto the bench beside her mother and was leaning against her with the complete physical confidence of a child who knew exactly where safety was. Tell me about the Oreth survey, he said. The secondary channel identification. She told him. He listened with the full attention he'd given everything out here that required it, the pump cycle's irregularities, the weather signals, the hydroponic array's moods. She was precise, and she was complete, and she didn't simplify for him, which he appreciated. He asked questions when he had them. She answered them without softening the technical complexity. After a while he noticed that Teva's eyes were at half-mast. She sleeps hard in storms, Vareth said, without looking down. The pressure change does something. She's been asleep in worse weather than this. There's a spare module, he said. The same one you used before, I kept it maintained. She looked at him then. Of course you did, she said. After Teva was asleep, they stayed at the table. Vareth had her survey notebook out, the small one from her left vest pocket, the pages filled in the 3-color notation. She'd spread it open on the table without ceremony, and he'd pulled the nearest of his 6 notebooks from the lower cabinet to sit beside it, and they were doing what 2 careful people with a shared problem did when they had access to both datasets for the first time: comparing. The east boundary data was the richest overlap. He had 3 years of conductance readings at consistent intervals across the eastern approaches. She had 6 weeks of more intensive preliminary mapping from the first stay. The 2 datasets didn't contradict each other. They complemented. Her intensive readings at higher density confirmed what his long-run observations had tracked over time. Here, she said, pointing to a section of her notation. This transect, I got an anomalous reading on the 3rd pass that I marked provisional because I didn't have time for a 4th pass before the parts were ready. She looked at his notebook. What do you have at this coordinate? He found the approximate coordinate in his notes. He'd been using a different reference system, which would need translation, but the general area was identifiable. Higher conductance than the surrounding transects, consistent across all 3 seasons. The anomaly is real, she said. There's more water there than the compact record shows. The water rights for the Eastern Plateau settlements are based on the compact record. She was quiet for a moment. This will take several seasons to document properly enough to trigger a formal reassessment. It's been wrong for 6 years, he said. A few more seasons won't hurt the aquifer. No, she said, but it changes the calculation for the settlement families. If the water allocation is based on an incorrect boundary, they may be paying fees on water they're not legally required to pay for, or drawing from sources they're entitled to but don't know it. She looked at the table. The impact is downstream. He thought about that too, the way a single incorrect map propagated its error through all the decisions made against it. The aquifer boundary wrong in the record meant the maintenance schedules for the groundwater extraction points were wrong, which meant the seasonal draw calculations were wrong, which meant the supply estimates the settlement families were working from were wrong. A single error, 6 years old, branching. The Orth reassessment, he said. How long did it take? 18 months to complete the formal survey, 6 months of review. Then the Water Rights Authority required a second independent assessment. She paused. 2 years total before the allocation was corrected. And the settlements? The affected settlements received partial rebate for the previous 3 seasons' overassessment. It was processed correctly in the end. She looked at him. The work matters. The timeline is what it is. He nodded. He poured more tea both cups without asking. She accepted hers without comment. Outside, the trailing wind of the storm moved against the habitat walls in the long, irregular way it had when the main body had passed, and what remained was the basin's recovery. You'll need a desk, he said. Varith looked up from the notebook. For the survey notes, he said. The work table seats 2, but the notation system takes space. There's a room in the northeast module that hasn't been used since I decommissioned the equipment in it. I can clear it and put a proper desk in. I have a field desk in the transport, she said. It folds. A folding desk isn't adequate for 3 seasons of formal survey documentation. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said, it isn't. I'll get the material on the Verath run. The northeast module has good morning light. She was quiet. Then, good morning light is useful for the 3-color notation. The green is difficult to read in artificial light. I'll get a daylight lamp as well, for the winter. Another pause. She was looking at him with the evaluating expression, not surprised exactly, but recalibrating. He got the impression she'd come prepared for a different kind of conversation. Not a bad one, just one that ended differently, with less settled ground under it. You're already planning, she said. I plan forward, he said. It's more efficient than planning in place. Something moved through her face, the thing that was not quite a laugh but was near it. Yes, she said, I remember. She looked at the notebooks. He looked at the notebooks. The storm outside was settling into its final diminishment, the wind dropping to long, infrequent gusts, the silence in between growing wider. The northeast module, she said finally. I want to see the light angle. Tomorrow morning, he said, when the angle is right. She nodded, a smaller, slower nod than Teva's decisive one. Something that had thought about it first. They worked through another hour of data, comparing transects against 3 seasons of conductance readings, before the wind outside went quiet in the final way that meant the storm had passed completely. By then they had identified 7 anomaly points where the 2 datasets agreed, 3 apparent divergences that were probably reading different aquifer layers, and 1 point on the northern approach road that neither dataset had covered, a gap between his survey routes and hers. That's the first transect for the formal survey, she said, marking the gap. I'll note the access heading for it. It's reachable from the second northern road. The one I don't know yet. The one I'll show you in 11 days. She closed her notebook. He closed his. The kitchen was quiet and warm, the heating array running its evening cycle, the lamp throwing its particular warm light. Outside, the basin was the way it was after a storm, clean and large and still. You kept maintaining the spare module, she said. Yes. That wasn't efficient, if you expected it to stay empty. No, he said, it wasn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the table, and then at nothing particular, and then back at him. Good, she said. It was the same word Teva had used at breakfast, the same decisive single syllable. The family resemblance was very clear. He turned down the lamp. In the morning, before Teva was awake, he went out and fixed the antenna housing. The storm had passed in the night, not gradually, but the way Kareth Basin storms always ended. Suddenly, like a door closing, the sustained wind dropping to intermittent gusts, and then to nothing within the space of an hour. He'd lain awake for some of that, listening to the transition. The habitat walls in the silence had a different quality than in the noise, more present or more specific. He'd been aware of them in the way you became aware of things that had been background. The morning was cold and clean. The flat had been scoured by the storm, every pebble sharp in the new light, the pale dust redistributed in long, smooth lines that followed the prevailing wind direction. The mesa faces on the north side were throwing their long shadows west, and the sky above the eastern rim was going from amber to white as the sun cleared it. The antenna housing repair took 40 minutes, a loose mounting bracket that had been vibrating against its housing in the wind, and a worn seal around the cable entry that had been the source of the harmonic. He had both parts in the parts cabinet. He'd been meaning to do this repair for 2 months and had kept finding more urgent things. He replaced both components, ran a frequency check on the relay, and stood on the equipment bay roof in the new morning light and looked out over the basin. He had 6 notebooks of observations about this place. He had 3 years of understanding about how the wind moved across the mesa faces and where the aquifer was and wasn't, and how the storm cycles tracked across the seasons, and what the scrub did when the cold wind came in from the north. He had a hydroponic array that worked better than it had been designed to because he'd spent 3 years learning its particular preferences. He had a pump that ran clean. He had, somewhere below him in the spare habitat module, a 2-year-old child who was going to find every fault in the equipment bay within 20 minutes of being awake, and was going to want the timeline for each repair. He had no idea what came next in any complete sense. He was fine with that. He knew how to work with incomplete information, which was the same as saying he knew how to work, which was the same as saying he knew how to live. The next thing would be what the next thing was. He would do it correctly when the time came. He heard the door below him and looked down. Teva came out of the habitat door with the focused intention of a person who had places to be and wasted no time on transitions. She was wearing the same small suit she'd been wearing yesterday, and she had her mother's straight-backed walk already, and she was heading directly for the equipment bay wall with the specific attention of someone who had thought about that wall seam during the night and had returned to complete the assessment. Vareth came out behind her, 2 cups of something hot, and looked up at him on the roof. He held up the worn seal and the old bracket. She looked at them both with a quick assessing glance and nodded, the small decisive nod. He climbed down. The bracket was loose, he said, and the cable seal was worn. I could hear the frequency variation in the harmonic last night, she said. The bracket was my first guess. You were right. She handed him a cup. He took it. It was tea made correctly, he noticed, without meaning to, that she'd found the right cabinet. The one with the proper tea, not the everyday kind. She'd known which one because she'd cataloged the kitchen last night while he was cooking, filed the information. Below them, Teva had completed her return assessment of the wall seam and had now moved on to the pump housing at the base of the equipment bay, which she was examining with her palms flat on the metal casing, the way she'd examined the floor seam. She hears it, Vareth said. He listened. The pump was running its morning cycle, the slight irregular catch in the secondary draw that he'd been nursing along for 6 weeks, almost imperceptible over the basin wind, a small thing in the rhythm. Teva looked up at him. The pump has a sound it shouldn't have, he said. I know about it, I'm working on it. Teva looked at the pump housing, then at him, then at the pump housing. Then she pointed at it, then at the parts cabinet, with the clarity of someone who had identified the problem and the solution, and was simply checking whether the solution was available. "The replacement part is on order," he said. 11 days. Teva considered this. The pale gold eyes moved from the seal housing to the parts cabinet to his face and back again, running the calculation. Then she made the small, decisive nod. "She's accepted the timeline," Vareth said. "Good," he said. He knelt beside the pump housing and opened the access panel anyway. Not because the repair was possible today, but because a person who wanted to understand the fault deserved to see it. He showed Teva where the secondary draw pipe met the seal housing, and the slight imperfection in the seal, not failing, not yet, but wearing in a way that produced the irregular catch in the cycle. He showed her how the wear pattern formed, which direction the particulate moved, why the joint between the primary and secondary draws was the stress point. Teva listened with her head slightly tilted, watching his hands as he pointed. When he finished, she pointed at the seal housing and looked at him with a question. "Why there?" he said. "Because the particulate in the basin air gets into the housing through the primary draw and settles in the joint because the secondary draw angle creates a low-velocity pocket. The particulate accumulates, and the seal wears faster where it's thickest." Teva appeared to find this a complete explanation. She looked at the joint for another moment, confirming what she'd been told against what she could see, and then made the small, decisive nod. He closed the access panel. She moved on to the next cabinet, to the tie-down cleats on the transport's port anchor, to the base of the borehole housing where the morning light was doing something specific to the shadow patterns on the casing. She was building her map. She would have the entire equipment bay understood before the morning was over. He stood and looked out over the flat. The transport was where they'd tied it down the night before, the hull color bleached pale in the morning light, the anchor line still taut from the night's loading. Beyond it, the basin opened out toward the mesa faces and the aquifer boundary that wasn't properly mapped in any record he'd been able to find. 3 seasons of survey work ahead, at minimum. More if the contract renewed. The kind of work that would, in the end, rewrite the water rights of the entire East Basin. Decades of incorrect allocation corrected by careful observation and the willingness to say that the original map was wrong. He thought about that. 11 days to Varath, he said. If the weather holds, Vareth said. It will. The storm was the last of the season. The basin goes quiet after this until the cold wind comes, and that's 60 days yet. He paused. I can take you through the northern access roads on the way out. There are 3 that aren't on any compact record. The first one cuts 40 minutes off the Mesa circuit. She was looking at him with the specific evaluating look, the one that checked a result against a prior calculation. I would want to note them for the formal survey record, she said. I'll show you the approach angles. The first one requires a specific entry heading or the road isn't visible from the track. I want coordinates and approach headings for all 3. I'll take the rover out tomorrow and get them. The light's better for the approach readings in the afternoon. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the east boundary survey I started during the 6 weeks. I have 3 seasons of preliminary notes in archive. If I can retrieve them from the compact survey system, they would give us a baseline for the formal contract. He noticed the pronoun. He thought she had noticed it too, the slight pause after it, the careful non-acknowledgement of it that was its own kind of acknowledgement. My 6 notebooks would add 3 years of aquifer behavior data, he said. Weather cycles, seasonal patterns, the conductance readings from the eastern approach. That's a comprehensive baseline. It's everything I've been looking at, he said. I didn't have a methodology for it. I was just writing down what I saw. That's what a baseline survey is, she said. Writing down what you see correctly in a form someone else can use. She looked at him. The methodology comes from the data. You had the data. He thought about the 6 notebooks in the lower cabinet. 6 seasons of mornings, 6 seasons of the pump cycle, the weather signals read from the smell of the wind, the aquifer behavior mapped in conductance units from a handheld meter, borrowed from a supply runner who'd asked why Mail wanted it and been satisfied with the answer that there was water under the flat, and he wanted to understand where it went. "I'll pull the notebooks," he said. "We can go through them before Verath, identify what's usable." "All of it will be usable," she said, with the same calm certainty she had when she stated facts. "You are a systematic observer. The form won't be standard, but the data will be sound." He didn't know what to do with that, so he drank his tea. Below them, Teva had worked her way to the borehole housing and was pressing both palms against the outer casing with her eyes closed, feeling the vibration of the motor inside. She stood like that for a long moment, very still, taking a reading by a method that was entirely her own. "She does that too," Varath said quietly. "What is she reading?" "I don't know exactly. She says the machine has a sound she can feel better with her hands than hear with her ears." Varath paused. "I don't think she's wrong. She's found 2 faults that way that I couldn't hear." He watched the child standing with her palms flat on the borehole housing, patient and still, waiting for what the machine would tell her. "She can help me with the pump diagnostics," he said, "when the part comes in." "She'll want to," Varath said. "She'll want to understand the whole repair." "I'll show her each step." Varath was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the particular register she used for things that were true and carefully chosen, "I am sorry it was 4 years, Mail." "You've said that." "I know. I want to say it properly." She was looking at the basin, not at him, the long flat of it, the mesa faces going gold in the climbing light, the survey plane beyond where the measurement stakes were probably still in the ground from her first visit if the storms hadn't pulled them. "I made choices that were partly about protecting myself. I want you to know I know that." He considered it. The 42 days and the thermocouple housing and the careful silence about the contact record, and the 4 years of the basin being exactly what it was with no one in the spare habitat module, and nothing to show for the absence except that the pump was running better, and the array was producing a third more. "You're here now," he said, with a complete answer. She looked at him then. The held careful thing in her face, the thing that had been bracing against something for a long time, did the last of its releasing, not all at once, carefully, the way she did everything. "Yes," she said, "I am." Teva came back from the borehole housing and stood between them and looked up at both of them with her enormous pale gold eyes and said something that was clearly a summary statement. 2 languages stacked, decisive, complete. Then she pointed at the habitat door. "She wants breakfast," Varath said. "I'll make it," Mail said. He went inside. Behind him, he heard Varath speaking to Teva in low Thessi, something patient and specific, a question from the child and a careful answer, and then the both of them following him in, Teva's footsteps with the particular weight of a small person who moves with intention. The kitchen in the morning light had the quality that kitchens had when they were used things in their places, the equipment cabinet closed and latched, the counter clear except for what was needed. He found the bread and the grain paste, and a portion of the roasted root from last night that was still good cold, and he put it all on the table the way he would have put it on the table for himself. Efficiently, without ceremony, the portions calculated and the arrangement practical. Teva examined every cabinet in the kitchen while he worked, found 2 additional faults, and reported each one to him with the small decisive nod. He told her the timeline for each repair. She accepted them, nodded, and climbed onto the bench beside her mother. They ate breakfast in the morning light. Outside, the basin was doing what it always did after a storm, the flat pale and clean, the mesa faces sharp in the new light, the wind barely moving. The kind of morning the basin held for about 2 weeks after the last major storm of the season, before the cold wind started to come down from the north. Clear mornings and long afternoons, and the particular stillness that came when the big weather was done, and the landscape settled back into itself. Teva ate with focused efficiency. Vareth ate and looked at the table, not the sensor stillness, but the look of someone thinking clearly after a long time of having to think around something. 11 days to Varath. The northern access roads and the coordinates and the survey coordinator and the supply run. 3 seasons of preliminary notes from Vareth's archive and 6 notebooks from the lower cabinet, and a methodology that had been sitting in the data for 6 years waiting for someone to come and recognize it. The pump in 11 days, the hinge in the morning, the upper cabinet seal on the next supply run. Teva at the borehole housing with her palms flat on the casing, taking a reading by a method that was entirely her own. The east boundary, he said. What's your plan for the first survey leg? Vareth looked up. Something in her face shifted, the settled thing, easing further. The look of someone who has set down a weight she's been carrying for a long time, and who is beginning to understand that the ground she's standing on is solid enough that she doesn't need to pick it back up. Mesa circuit first, she said. 3 passes, different times of day to get the full conductance profile. Then the flat, working east in parallel transects. She paused. I'll want to compare against your conductance readings before I set the transect spacing. I can pull the relevant notebooks today. After the hinge repair, she said. After the hinge repair, he agreed. Teva finished her breakfast, arranged the remains of her bread with the precision of a person for whom arrangement was its own satisfying task, and looked at both of them with the pale gold eyes. She said something, one short word decided in a language that was both and neither. She says good, Vareth told him. He looked at the child, the straight-backed small person who pressed her palms against machines to hear what they were saying and found every fault in every room, and accepted repair timelines with the nod of a person recording a commitment. Good, he said. Outside, the basin was quiet. The storm had passed completely. The morning was clean and cold, and the mesa faces were turning gold in the climbing light, and somewhere beyond the mesa faces was the east boundary of the aquifer, incorrectly recorded in every official document for the past 6 years, waiting for someone to come and find where it actually was. He pushed back his chair and went to get his tools. And